Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I have to say how grateful I am to the High Museum for the opportunity to collaborate with them on this great show. Some people told me, oh yeah, I've been here 3 times already. I'm just getting started looking at it. And those of you who haven't made your way to see the show, you have a wonderful treat in store for you. And those who have seen it already can see it again and see new things. I invite you to do so. It's my privilege today to introduce Professor Farah Griffin, who is my beloved sister and colleague. I want to start what I have to say with 2 quotations. The first from August Wilson. Looking at a Bearden painting, the playwright said, "I found myself entering the world of Romare Bearden and found a world made in my image, a world of flesh and muscle and blood and bone and fire, a world made of scraps of paper, of grace and birds and trains and guitars and women bathing and men with huge hands and huge hearts, pressing on life until it gave back something in kinship." The second 2 quotes really are from Bearden himself. He told an interviewer, "We are, all of us, faced with chaos in life. When Monet looks at a haystack or an African sculptor looks at a tree trunk, the artist is trying to look at a particular chaos with an eye to find something in there, trying to bring some passion, something that can move people. The demagogue sees chaos as an opportunity for power. The artist, on the other hand, always sees chaos as a chance for redemption." Elsewhere, he goes on to say, "I've chosen to paint the life of my people as I know it and I feel it, passionately and dispassionately. The artist identifies with the self-reliance, the hope, and the courage of the people. For art must always go where the energy is. There's enough ugliness in the world. I'm trying to create the beautiful, to show you the beauty of Black people." As I say, I'm here to introduce Farah Griffin, who will speak today about Bearden. Like him, she is a devout and brilliant lover of beauty. You can feel that love in the flow of her sentences, in her outlook on life, and in her personal culture. Wait till you see the shoes and the stockings and all of that. Jewelry. Her family nickname, appropriately enough, is Jazzy. Farah Griffin. My beloved friend and colleague is a star of the Columbia University faculty, much admired by the teachers as well as the students. She's won all the awards for teaching, including the one decided by students alone, and is a distinguished named chair holder in English and Comparative Literature and chair of the new African American Studies department. She teaches in the Center for Jazz Studies and helped create that field. Columbia, alas, is the last of the Ivies to accept African American Studies as a PhD granting department, something that never would have happened without the brilliancy of mind, and if I say so, the velvet hammer persuasiveness of this woman today. We have a stellar faculty in African American and African Diaspora Studies, that's the full name of the new department, and she built it. She has written an eloquent and moving narrative study of Miles Davis and John Coltrane called Clawing at the Limits of Cool. She has great titles. She has a book about Billie Holiday called If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery. Her book called Harlem Nocturne focuses on the dancer Pearl Primus, the composer Mary Lou Williams, and the novelist Ann Petrie. Her book on the Great Migration is called Who Set You Flowing? It takes its title from Jean Toomer's book called Cain. She's written about the literature, art, and music associated with the Great Migration. That book, Who Set You Flowing, and the other books are taught and read everywhere. In all these books, the graduate of the Baldwin School of Bryn Mawr, it tickles me to death that you went to the Baldwin School. This American Studies PhD from Yale, BA from Harvard, is both an historian and a close reader of complex texts at the level of zero to the bone. I use this phrase, zero to the bone, to suggest that in her writing, some of which she calls personal criticism, she's ever the writer herself. In her narration, we meet her father, who must have been a wonderful man. We meet her perfect person mother. We get to know this fabulous woman herself. Of course, she told an interviewer, she's very much aware of the latest post-structural critical lingo and angles of vision. But as a prime example of the scholar as writer, like Bearden, she's always looking for something fresh, something that is hers. Her subject is beauty. Her subject, like Bearden's, is redemption and how we got over. To speak about the migration narrative in Bearden, and perhaps to share some of her new work in progress, my beloved sister, Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Robert O'Mealy. I just said to him, you're writing my recommendation when I apply for a fellowship. I love hearing how I sound in his words, so thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for being here. You could be many places. Some of you could be at Oprah, I'm hearing. But you're here, and I don't take that for granted. I'm very grateful to you for being here. I'm so honored to be in the midst of this beautiful show, Something Over Something Else. I've been calling it Bearden in Atlanta, because to me that's just a dream match, two wonderful things brought together. I want to thank those who brought these works to us, who conceived of this exhibition and the programming around it, and who invited me to participate, especially Stephanie and Robert O'Mealy for their tireless effort, and also Catherine Huff, Erin Dowdery, and especially Yema Thomas for all their assistance. And finally, I want to thank all of you for being here. So this afternoon, I want first to discuss Bearden in relation to other African American artists who have helped us to make sense of the mass movements of Black peoples in two internal migrations, which we call the First and Second Great Migration. And then I want to look at Bearden's contribution to a kind of collective project of visualizing, representing, giving shape and meaning to this phase of Black life in North America, before turning to the ways that he differs from some of the other artists of his generation and before who took up migration, and in so doing to position him at the forefront of many of those who came later and began to reconsider the South and its place and ongoing significance for Black Americans, especially in the years following the end of the Second Great Migration. And then finally, as Bob said, I nervously will close by sharing a portion of my own current work in progress, and I emphasize that it's a work in progress, so bear with me. And this will be the first time I share this portion of it publicly. But I do so because it has been, in part, sparked and inspired and informed by Bearden's work. Neither of the works that I will refer to in this last section are on display here, but I thought about them in relation to this series because they're of the same period and they share so much with the spirit and the impetus of the profile series. And I think it just goes to show that he was producing art that made up this series, and he was also producing art in and around it. Just, you know, the sheer prolific nature of what he was doing as he was thinking through some of these issues. And then I have a disclaimer because I know who I'm standing before, and I know a lot of people I know and love in this audience, many of whom are artists and art historians and art critics. And so I have a disclaimer, and I say that I do not approach Bearden's work as an art historian or an art critic, although I know I have much to learn about the formal qualities of his work from all of these people. I suppose I approach it for lack of a better word, is a cultural historian who seeks to look at the broad context and the times that shape Bearden and that he helped to shape. I approach him as a writer myself who finds inspiration in his work and, most importantly, in his model. So let's get started. I'm going to move this title because my own title, the secret is the migration, movement, and mobility in this presentation is actually my title because it's going to change a little bit. But I'm just going to put that image up there for us to think about, and I'll get to it. Some artists create epic works, and in so doing, they give depth and dimension to history. Think of Homer, who dramatized the birth of the Greek people and culture by rendering history as myth and poetry. Virgil did the same for Rome, and the Old Testament scribes certainly did it for the ancient Hebrews. African Americans in the United States are a new people of ancient origin, a people whose nation initially denied them full membership, a people forged in the Middle Passage, but created as much by their own innovation and resilience as they were by the very conditions which have oppressed them. This people produced artists, world-renowned and anonymous. A select few, steeped in history, spiritually attuned, and blessed with the gift of imagination, artistic talent, and the discipline of deep study, made themselves vehicles through which their people's history might emerge as epic, as mythic and poetic, as both particular and universal. Some of them we know we only need to say one name: Ellington, Ellison, Morrison, Ailey, Wilson, and yes, Bearden. These are our great epic artists, and the history that inspires them is indeed made up of huge dramatic moments that show humanity at its best and its worst. The Middle Passage, enslavement and emancipation, Reconstruction, the Nadir, the Great Migration, and the many movements of a multi-dimensional freedom struggle known variously as the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, the Movement for Black Lives. Yep. These historical namings, neatly divided and periodized, are linear and progressive. But it is the ease of this trajectory that our epic artists reject, disrupt, worry, even as they contribute to it. They imbue histories known and forgotten with a sense of fits and starts. Significantly, with the exception of Ailey, each of these artists, Ellington, Ellison, Morrison, Wilson, and Bearden, turn their attention to the Great Migration, one of those moments of fits and starts, a mass movement of peoples, a movement toward freedom that too often resulted in further confinement, segregation, incarceration. A movement that transformed the places the migrants left, the places of their arrival, and the migrants themselves. What is known as the Great Migration actually took part in two waves, as most of you know. The first wave taking place roughly from around 1916 to 1930, when the tide was stemmed because of the Depression. Bearden's biographer, Mary Schmidt Campbell, asserts that sometime around 1915, his parents, Bessie and Howard Bearden, brought their 4-year-old son from Charlotte, North Carolina to New York, making them among the earliest to take part in the first Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1918, over 400,000 blacks, almost 1,500 a day, left the South. They left rural areas for southern cities and northern cities. In 1910, 7 million black people lived in the South. By 1925, 1/10 of the black population in the U.S. had moved north. They were met with some opportunity for greater mobility, physical, social, and political, but they were also met with residential segregation and mob violence. The second Great Migration found migrants going the routes of earlier migrants and also going to new places. And this period we think about is from about 1940 to roughly 1970. It was longer, it was more sustained, it was more diverse, and it is during this period that the words urban and inner city are simply euphemisms for Black. When you hear urban radio, you know what that means. Didn't always mean that. They took new routes, the old ones still from Carolina and Georgia to Philadelphia, to Philadelphia and New York, Alabama to Detroit, but also places like Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma to California. And many of the second wave of migrants were already urban dwellers, having migrated from rural areas to southern cities and then to cities throughout the Northeast Midwest and West. After 1940, larger numbers of women migrated. Many of the new migrants had kinfolk in the North, and they moved into Black communities that were already more developed. And they provided the power behind the growth of the NAACP, behind unions, the March on Washington movement, the Double V movements. These waves of migration gave birth to a new artistic genre, which I have elsewhere termed the migration narrative. Musical, literary, and visual works through which Black intellectuals and artists attempted to come to terms with the massive dislocation of Black peoples following migration. When the brilliant Atlanta resident, Isabel Wilkerson, published her magisterial, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's great Black migration, in 2010, critics rightly hailed it as a tour de force. They also hailed it as the first attempt to tell the story. While it may be the most ambitious and unique in its narration and method, Wilkerson, who is my friend, would be among the first to note that it was not the first effort to tell the story. From 1902, with the publication of Paul Laurence Dunbar's Sport of the Gods, through Toni Morrison's Jazz of 1992 and beyond, the migration narrative emerged as the 20th century's dominant form of African American cultural production. We hear it in blues lyrics. Times is getting mighty harsh, money getting mighty scarce. Soon as I sell my cotton and corn, I was gonna leave this place, is one lyric. Or, boll weevil in the cotton, cutworm in the corn, devil in the white man, I'm good and gone. Poetry, Langston Hughes's One-Way Ticket. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. Richard Wright's biography in its original form, Black Boy and American Hunger Together, is a migration narrative. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a migration narrative, and his protagonist is a migrant. Toni Morrison's Jazz is a migration narrative. In fact, her body of work is full of migrants. Pecola's Parents in the Bluest Eye are migrants. And her penultimate novel, Home, is the story of Frank Money, a traumatized Korean War veteran who is a migrant, but also a prodigal son who spends most of the novel returning south. And then, of course, there is Stevie Wonder's Living for the City, the migration contained in the lyrics and the music. I can look at this audience and know you all know what I'm talking about. You know, a boy is born in Hardtown, Mississippi. What is he surrounded by? Four walls that ain't so pretty. His parents give him love and affection to keep him strong, moving in the right direction. Why? There you go. That's that call and response. Over the course of the 20th century, the emphasis on the migration narrative shifts in the ways that will be important for aspects of Bearden's work. During the years following the Harlem Renaissance, throughout the Depression up to World War I, Richard Wright's version of the migration narrative is the dominant portrayal. The South is not a site of possibility for the migrant. It's a site of terror, of the ongoing crimes against humanity committed against Black people. Even when when Wright returns south in Black Boy. We get that sense there. Although Hurston provides an alternative to Richard Wright, his view is the dominant vision. The period following World War II serves as a kind of transition from Wright to the emergence of Ralph Ellison, and that era is marked by the publication of Ellison's Invisible Man in 52 and Bearden's Go Tell It on the Mountain in 53. And while neither present a character of anyone who comes back to the South itself as an idea begins to become more complicated. They begin to suggest the possibilities of the South, privileging it as being very important to certain elements of Black culture. And following the civil rights and Black power movement, Toni Morrison's version of the migration narrative becomes the dominant one. The South is the place of redemption. It is the place of identity. It is the presence of the ancestor. This image emerges as the dominant form of the migration narrative following the civil rights movement because the South is the locus of great social change, unlike the North. And it is forged not by those who left, but by those who chose to stay. It can be seen and considered as a place of cultural origin, and Bearden is part of this understanding of the South. Throughout the history of migration, Black artists have revealed the ways that mobility and movement give way to newer, more complex, more sophisticated forms of confinement. And while Jacob Lawrence created the most well-known visual migration narrative with his migration series of the Negro Series in 1941, we find no straightforward migration narrative in Bearden's work, perhaps with the exception of the Odyssey, the Black Odyssey series. The ubiquitous Bearden's work instead, especially here in the Profile series, is organized as its own kind of autobiographical migration narrative where we follow the images from North Carolina to Pittsburgh and to Harlem. In individual works, though, migration is apparent primarily in the way that it is suggested, a train in the background of works set in or evocative of the South, an urban scene with elements of the South in the frame. But the ubiquitous train is a reminder that folk were always leaving, constantly leaving. There is a consistency in the train imagery. When Bearden returned south for the first time in 1940, he joined a tradition of African American thinkers and artists who made the reverse migration and made works out of that migration. Du Bois's Southern Turn resulted in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. Toomer's Time in Sparta, Georgia resulted in Cain, 1923. Bearden, in the 1940s, joined a number of artists of his generation who had migrated as children and turned south after the war. Bearden went in 1940. Pearl Primus, who was born in Trinidad and migrated to New York with her family at the age of 3, comes to Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina in 1944 and turns that material into material for her dance. Eldazir Couture, the artist, migrated from Virginia with his family as a child and went to the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia in 1944. All of these artists engaged in what the critic Robert Steptoe has called a journey of immersion, and I quote, "A ritualized journey into a symbolic South in which the protagonist seeks aspects of tribal literacy." And at the completion of this immersion journey, the protagonist gains a sufficient literacy to assume what Steptoe tells us is the mantle of an articulate kinsman. Bearden's Southern Turn gifted us with a number of works, including many that are part of the Profile series. And in her essay for the catalog that accompanies this exhibition, Self-Revealing Autobiography, Narrative, and Bearden's Profile series, Stephanie Height astutely and convincingly argues that Bearden himself resists narrative and pursues abstraction. Writing about Part 2, the 30s, she notes, quote, "Rather than disclosing a single narrative, his storyline is constructed in disparate pieces that, when assembled together, allow us to witness the story from many points of view," end quote. And often, in his suggestions, he produces images that are as much about stillness interiority, and quietude as they are about mobility and movement. And I think that this is the difference between like a 25-year, I guess, project of thinking about migration in Black art, so that the title of my talk, which the subtitle is about mobility, movement, and migration, when I come back and I reconsider someone like Bearden, I realize that the works that refer to migration are as often about stillness, interiority, and quietude as they are about migration and mobility. There's another critic, Kevin Quashie, who talks about how much we think about Black art as being resistant, as being protest, as being loud. But in so doing, we forget, or we tend to undermine the ways that art is not only about resistance, but also about other capacities, he says, like quiet. I think that Bearden often gives us both mobility and stillness, sound and quiet, living out loud and interiority. And it's in the works that recollect the South that we get the complex, quiet tension of this relationship between movement and stillness, between leaving and staying behind. This image, which is not one of the profile series, is one that I want to turn to now because it's important whenever we think of migration in Bearden. This image is titled Return of the Prodigal Son. It's a mixed media collage on canvas that was created in 1967, and it's based on the biblical parable of the prodigal son, whereby a father bequeaths his land to his two sons, one who stays and cultivates it, the other who leaves and squanders his share. And then when the latter returns home, he is embraced and welcomed by his father. The story of the prodigal son is often featured in Western art history. Bearden's son, though, is greeted not by a patriarch or a brother even, but by two women. And while the son figure looks directly at us, the two women who greet him are positioned in profile. And there's something different and distinct about them. They are both of our time and place, and yet there is something ancient and even otherworldly about them. They are sculpturable. They're like sculptures and mask-like. In this way, I think that they invoke both the elders who welcome him, but also the ancestors. About this image, Bearden said the prodigal son left North Carolina, has gotten into bad company, and come back to the old folks, to his home, where Robert Frost says, no one else wants you. When no one else wants you, they got to take you in. The migrant here is not depicted in the northern city. He is back south, back home. He has returned. This image presents us with a return and anticipates a kind of reverse migration. And Bearden's explanation reminds me of one of Etheridge Knight's beautiful poems, The Idea of Ancestry, about the young man who's arrested for drug use but finds his way back south to a family picnic where he sees his ancestors in the faces of people who love him. Bearden's Prodigal Son is not the first in Black American art. Jean Toomer imagined Black artists as prodigal sons, returning to the seed and source of their art. Song of the Son, a poem which appears in the first part of Cain, he writes, to the ancestors, pour, oh pour that parting soul into song, oh pour it in the sawdust glow of night, in the velvet pine smoke air tonight, and let the valley carry it along, and let the valley carry it along. O land and soil, red soil and sweet gum tree, so scant of grass, so profligate of pines. Now, just before an epoch sun declined, thy son in time, I have returned to thee. Thy son in time, I have returned to thee. Song of the Son is a call to Black artists. It is a mandate, a tribute, an elegy, a plea. The Black artist returns south to the land of the ancestor just before the epoch of the Black folk dies. He turns to them for sources and inspiration. He seeks to turn their culture into art. But when Bearden returned south in 1940, he began to answer and also transcend Toomer's call. For Bearden, unlike Toomer, the South wasn't stuck in a past. It wasn't only source and inspiration, but it was prolificate of artists who cultivate beauty every day. It wasn't a dying culture, but a vibrant, living, and nourishing one. And he doesn't make a distinction between himself as artist and those who make art in their everyday lives. He learns from them and is part of a continuum that includes them. Bearden's Southern works are offerings of an articulate kinsman. He is fully aware that he presents an imaginative landscape, having said, quote, "You leave, but then return to the homeland of your imagination." I love that phrase, the homeland of your imagination. In Bearden's South, women figure prominently, especially in interior spaces. They are the nurturers, the forgivers, the cultural bearers. And as is the case in Toomer's Cane, Bearden's Southern works provide us with mysterious women who may be nude, but who nonetheless seem not fully available, not fully giving of themselves or giving up their power. Even his landscapes seem to sprout Black women. This one, Profile, the 20s, Mecklenburg County, Sunset Limited, which was chosen as the cover of an edition of Cane. We have a beautiful landscape featuring livestock as well as women, one holding a baby. There are many images of mothers holding babies, a kind of Madonna and child upright in the forefront. And then there's one who's lying down on the ground, nude, like she's organic to the landscape itself. And in the background, cutting through the plane of the canvas, is the train for which the painting is named. Migration is referenced, it's alluded to. This series is replete with trains. They are so ubiquitous, they almost go unnoticed, but they are a constant reminder, whether it's Daybreak Express, Mecklenburg County Sunset Limited, Moonlight Express, over and over and over again. If you get a chance, look for the trains. You might miss them, but they are constantly there. And one of the reasons why you might miss them is because they aren't front and center, right? They are just a constant part of the day. They are the front and center figures are the people, and most often the women. Bearden's works of this period, especially those in this series, the Profile series, have Bearden, I think, at the forefront of another turn in Black art. For in the 1980s, much of Black art itself looked again to the South. And among the most eloquent and poetic of those who represent that turn southward were Black women writers. I want to suggest that Bearden and later the filmmaker Julie Dash render visible what artists like Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Toni K. Bambara import in their Southern narratives. If Sunset Limited is set outside with women who seem to be part of the natural landscape, there are a number of paintings in this series and also a number of collages in this series, and also this one, which is not. This is Morning Train to Durham, which bring us inside within a domestic space. The train, again, in the background, this time seen through the window, moving through time and space. The southern interior space is not entirely protected from the outdoors, except for that broom across the doorway, which is a kind of domestic tool, but also, if you come from the kind of family I come from, it's a spiritual tool too, because if you sweep somebody with a broom, you can send them to jail. So I think of that broom as kind of offering a kind of crossroads or a threshold, right, there. But here in these domestic interior spaces, the window and the door allow nature to come inside, but this is still a domestic space. Interestingly enough, in some of the collages that are set in the north, like Susanna in Harlem, you'll get a similar nude figure like this one. Susanna's bathing, for instance, and there is also a door and a window, but the doors in the northern, a lot of the northern collages are closed, And the windows are often dressed with a curtain or mostly a shade as well. But this moving train behind the window, that we see out the window is a kind of haunting presence. But the center of this scene again is the woman, the semi-nude woman. Does the departing train carry her lover, I find myself asking. And the blues answers, I hate to see that evening sun go down. I hate to see that evening sun go down, 'cause my lovin' baby done left this town. Or maybe she's dressing to catch the train, feeling tomorrow like I feel today, said I'm feeling tomorrow like I feel today, I'm gonna pack my trunk and make my getaway. Hazel Carberry reminds us that migration had a distinctly different meaning for Black men and women. Migration for women often meant being left behind. My sweet man done gone and left me dead, or my daddy left and I'm standing in the door, or the sound of the train fills my heart with misery. Carby goes on to say it was not easy for women as it was for men to hop freight trains, and if money was saved for tickets, it was usually men who were sent. The train, which had symbolized freedom and mobility for men, for male blues songs, became a contested symbol for women. The sound of the train whistle, a mournful signal of imminent desertion and future loneliness, was eventually reclaimed by them as a sign that women, too, were on the move. Bearden's collages are populated by the same figures that fill Black women's novels of the same period, the conjure women of Gloria Naylor's Mama Day and Toni K. Bambara's The Salt Eaters, the magical gardens that we see in his Maudel Sleet's Magical Garden are works that recall Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Walker could have been describing Maudel Sleet's garden when she writes, quote, my mother adorned with flowers whatever shabby house we lived in, whatever she planted grew as if by magic. Because of her creativity with flowers, even my memories of poverty are seen through a screen of blooms. Sunflowers, petunias, roses, dahlias, forsythia, and on and on. Her mother, like Bearden's gardeners, cultivated a quotidian beauty. They created a Black woman's aesthetic made manifest in the beauty of their gardens, their quilting, their singing, and through his later Southern paintings and collages and drawings, Bearden is one of the primary artistic figures naming and claiming the aesthetic contributions of Black Southern women and in positing them as central to his own artistic vision. By placing them in works that reference migration, he calls our attention to the migrants, to what they lost and left, what they brought with them, and to the ongoing living art of those who remained. I want to return for a moment to Stephanie Height's essay in the volume that accompanies this exhibition. She writes of Bearden's image, title, and caption work together that she says complete an impression, provide a description rather than a narrative. That Bearden's works in the series often leave unanswered questions that narrative would seek to answer. As such, they provide a space for us, the viewers, to enter and complete them, similar to Toni Morrison saying that in her novels, she creates a space for the reader to come in and create the narrative with her. Height writes that although the people and places Bearden referred to throughout the project were inspired by his own memories, he jettisoned the details that might hinder viewers from seeing something of their own experience in it. And she notes the way that the playwright August Wilson found inspiration in the Profile series for what became his American Century series of plays. Specifically, as we know, Pittsburgh Memories, Milhand's Lunch was the image that inspired August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone. Now, I make no claims of being in the same league with Bearden or Wilson, but one of Bearden's work, along with the works of Morrison, has helped to spark or trigger the memories, images, and impressions that find form in my current work, a series of autobiographical reflections on my girlhood in Philadelphia, in a house of women, some of whom were migrants, and the relationship between those memories and my own readings of African American literature, music, and art. Bearden's works helped to trigger these memories, some of them. Several years ago, at an exhibition titled Romare Bearden Southern Recollections, I think it was around 2012, at the Newark Museum, I first encountered and became mesmerized by this image. It's called the Dressmaker, Mecklenburg Autumn China Lamp from 1983. It is not part of the profile series, but it certainly could be part of that series. It's around the same time. It's very evocative of some of the imagery and sensory perceptions that one gets in looking at the other ones. This image and another one, Autumn of the Red Hat, which I'll just go to and then come back. That one. These two images sparked my own memory of images, colors, shapes, and sounds and emotions that I found somewhat overwhelming and that have since been the basis of an autobiographical sketch that has found its way into my own current project. I remember seeing this image and going back to the museum over and over again because I found it so compelling, wanted to live with it. Here's another take on a theme we see throughout Bearden's Southern works. A nude younger woman, the protective older woman, here rendered as a dressmaker and her client in an intimate moment, which is a moment of a fitting. And the dressmaker is in profile, and she's blue. Found that fascinating. And so in that way, like the women of the Prodigal Son, the return of the Prodigal Son, there's something otherworldly and spiritual about her. But it's the color of the fabric, the curl of the measuring tape that echoes the kind of highlight curl that runs vine-like down the nude woman's back, behind, and legs. And here, the seamstress, like the gardener, like the quilter, is also an artist, a maker of beauty, a creator. This becomes even clearer here in this Autumn of the Red Hat, where the billowing tape measure that comes down behind the young woman gestures to the floor. And if we follow the billowing of that tape measure, we can also see how it echoes the broken strap of the guitar on the floor, making our eye look at both together, bringing the seamstress tool, the tape measure, together with the musical instrument, and the woman's work together with that of the musician. Bearden certainly respected and admired the artistry of musicians, and he portrayed them in a number of works. And critics have noted the importance of Black Southern women's quilts on Bearden's work as well. But I think that the seamstress and her craft, the dressmaker and her craft, also belongs with that of the musician, the quilter, the gardener, as subject and source of inspiration. Mary Schmidt Campbell notes that when Bearden married the beautiful Nanette Rohan, she brought a new ethos into his life, Campbell's words. She says, she often made her own clothes. Fabrics and patterns filled the Canal Street loft, along with magazines like Vogue, Ladies' Home Journal, Harper's Bazaar, and popular Black publications, Ebony and Jet. And these all became visual fodder for her husband. In both images, I am drawn to the color, the shape, but most importantly, for me, I am drawn to the sewing machine. It's the first thing that caught my eye. Like the trains of the other images, it is black and rectangular, a geometric form and color. Bearden's train and the sewing machine actually are quite the same in shape and color. And they both are machines that are functional objects of beauty, as significant for their design as their function. On my mother and father's side, I am the granddaughter of migrants from Georgia to Philadelphia. I am also the daughter, granddaughter, and grandniece of seamstresses. Both my mother and my grandmother had sewing machines almost exactly like the ones depicted in the Bearden works. Among my earliest memories are sitting under or next to a sewing machine as my mother sewed. Later, after my father's death, when I was 9 years old, my memories are awash with my mother sewing. The quiet buzz of her sewing machine is barely audible over the sound of Miles or Marvin or Earth, Wind, and Fire. My mother prefers to sew after midnight, after the dishes have been washed and the kitchen straightened up, after I have bathed and gone to bed, after the noise of the day has quieted. By morning's light, she will have solved a puzzle, pushed past a momentary challenge. She will have created something beautiful. She is meticulous. A finished seam pressed flat with the iron, a collar stiffened just right, a yoke, a dart. She attends to every detail, even if it means ripping it all out and starting over. And if I awaken and come down the narrow, dark staircase to find her sitting at the shiny black sewing machine with gold lettering, it was a singer. She is humming, and she seems happy. As a girl, I spent hours in bookstores with my father, hours more in fabric stores with my mother. Bolts of material unwrapped and unfurled, measured by the yard, cherished for its color and texture. I early on learned the difference between tweed and houndstooth, silk, wool, cotton, gingham, paisley, and madras plaid. Notions, buttons, trimmings, spools of threads, these were the items that actually distinguished a sewer's garment. Buttons make all the difference. Buttons can change the story a piece tells. They can communicate military strength and brass or delicate ladylike refinement. Buttons are in and of themselves objects of beauty and delight. My hands grew especially adept at removing the cherished buttons from old garments to be recycled and used again. Some were treated as heirlooms. My mother would say, "That button I used on your coat comes from the camel hair wool jacket Daddy bought for Mama in New York." I grew up with the lore and language of dressmakers. When having a dress fitted, put your thumb in your mouth so you don't get stuck with a pin. A string or a stray piece of thread on your clothing is a sign of money. I was imbued with an appreciation for the seamstress's art, though I had absolutely no desire to practice it. Reading and writing brought me the same delight that sewing brought my mother. My mother, through sewing, engaged in the art of transformation. She transformed not only the fabric, but those of us who wore her clothing. She gave us confidence. Mina made this for me was a statement of pride, and translated, it means Mina loves me. Throughout my childhood, my mother worked in Philly's many garment factories. Philadelphia had been a center of manufacturing, and she had no trouble finding work. She says, "I used to quit a job on one floor, go downstairs, and get another one in the same afternoon." She made everything from true form bras to men's ties, and in the 80s, just before the last of the good factory jobs went overseas, she made Adidas bathing suits as well as swimsuits for the United States Olympic swimming team. Even when she worked in garment factories in the evening, she sewed for family, neighbors, and friends. And though she hated doing alterations, she did them because they were lucrative. And other women came to my mother to have dresses made, taken in, or taken out, but mostly to talk. Those fittings, the whispered gossip, the laughter, the stories of troubled children and men loved and left, stories told with soft Southern accents, stories of going back home or sending their children there for the summer. I loved hearing these stories, these conversations, the texture and tone of their voices, the grown woman trouble they discussed, the depth of their laughter all filled my ears, and like Bearden, created a landscape of my imagination. And all these people brought in much-needed income, but truthfully, my mother preferred sewing for her family. Her home was her sanctuary, and she didn't like to have just anybody in it. But sewing for her sisters, her daughters, her mother, they brought joy. Sewing for them was the project that found her working until dawn, the time having flown by. She could make clothing for the women she loved without fitting them. One of my aunts is feeling down because she put on a little weight. Don't worry, Mina will make something flattering that will make her feel beautiful. Another lost the use of her right arm following a stroke. It was just hung there, dangling and useless, and my mother continued to make her dresses, but always crafted a beautiful sling of silk or chiffon that complemented whatever she was wearing. And as a young mother, my sister was overwhelmed with 4 small children. My mother grew concerned with what she thought was my sister's descent into dowdiness, so she made a few mini dresses for her. She's got the long legs for them, she said. And later, she affectionately expressed dismay for having done so. She said, I put that girl in short dresses and now I can't get her out of them. My sister preferred the mini long after they disappeared from the pages of fashion magazines. Creating beautiful things for the people and spaces she cherished was a process that brought focus and concentration. She made the occasional prom gown and bridesmaid dress for young women who may have shared a story about the loss of virginity or feared pregnancy. She took on those jobs because she welcomed the challenge and enjoyed the opportunity to be creative, but mostly she treasured the opportunity to provide a big sister's guidance. When I think of these years, I think of the beautiful space she created for us. I think of the sound of miles, the shade of blue, her favorite color, and the scent of lavender. And watching her pin a pattern on fabric that she would cut and sew, I learned that the care given to your work brings a blissful solitude and satisfaction. The beauty my mother cultivated was not for the white world, nor was it for men. Well, I should say not only for men, sometimes it was for men. It was to nurture, sustain, and please us. Less armor or seduction, it was a respite, a kind of sanctuary, an entertainment, a source of identity. And when I refer to the cultivation of beauty, I mean the cultivation of the aesthetic dimension of our lives. This is the dimension that inspired Bearden, in the way that he inspires me, such that his art both opens and informs my memory. That kind of beauty is a necessary balm to be found or created. It is a garden or a single flower, a flourishing houseplant, or an intricately woven textile, a cobalt blue bottle, a languorous cat, a Miles Davis solo, or Aretha singing Daydreaming, the whistle of a passing train, or the rare stillness and silence provided by a quick but weighty summer storm. The evocation of something long forgotten, placed in a deep corner of our memory, opened and opens, releases to us when we surrender to the page or the collage, when we ride the air, tracing migrations past, only to emerge on the other side as something new over something else. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have some time for questions or comments or anything, conversation. And there are 2 microphones that will come to you.
Yeah, okay, is it on? Okay. Your current project, and forgive me if you said it, but is it essays that you're working on, a book?
Yeah. It's a book that I'm working on, and it's, I realized that long before I became a professional critic, an academic, that I had a relationship to many of the works that I write about as a scholar. And the book is a kind of reflection on what those works meant to me when I first encountered them, or what they kind of spark in my understanding now when I read them, and when I'm honest and, say that much of my interest is autobiographical. It's not only scholarly. And I think that's what happened when I saw this painting. I immediately wanted to write about it, and I thought about ways to write about it as a critic, but then I was honest, and I said, it's that sewing machine. And the reason why I'm overwhelmed and I stand in front of it and I can't leave it is because of all these memories, so much so that I'm like, does she have fabric that was that shade of blue, or is it because Bearden, So the book gives me a chance to have a more personal encounter with those works of art. Yeah. Anything else? All the way back there.
First, I want to say thank you for coming to speak with us.
Thank you.
I have started to see you in every documentary.
It's my second career.
So when I got the email from the High saying that you would be here, I was like, oh, it's her. I've seen her all these documentaries. So my question to you, I'm actually a junior at Georgia State University.
Okay.
I'm a return student, so I dropped out when I first went in '88, and I came back 30 years later. So my question to you is, when you started out, did you have a vision of what you wanted to be, or have you sort of created yourself into something that you didn't know you were going to be?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I had a vision of what I wanted to be, but it wasn't what I became. So I think I would have to say I created it along the way. Yeah. I think it's been very improvisational, as much of life is, Like I can't say that when I was that little girl sitting there watching my mother sew, that I wanted to be an academic. I didn't know what an academic was. I mean, like that just wasn't an option. I wanted to be a writer, but I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and that was what I had planned to do and what I planned to be, until I had professors who suggested maybe I consider graduate school. And even then, I thought, well, that's a way to actually have a job and some benefits and still write. Yeah, so, but life takes you on all kinds of turns. And I think the phrase "ride the air," which I didn't explain because I was cutting things in the talk, it comes from, there are two things. There's a song called "Ride the Air," but there's also a line in Song of Solomon, at the end of Song of Solomon, where Morrison tells us that the protagonist, Milkman, says, if you surrender to the wind, you could ride it. And I often meditate on that what does that mean? And that notion of surrender, right? That sometimes you don't know where it's going. And that's, I think of the migrants, sometimes they had a plan, but they had to be open. They had to kind of surrender. They had to be improvisational in their living. And so I think that's what she means by that. And I think maybe there's an answer to your question somewhere in that, too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Farah, thank you for that. That was
Thank
beautiful.
You were one of the people I was nervous about.
No, I'm almost speechless. Curiosity about the new project. Do you talk about other artists? Other visual artists and musicians?
Yeah, so you remember, Deirdre, we were together. This is Deirdre Harris Kelly, who's the co-director of the Bearden Foundation. I think we were together when I discovered this, and then I kept asking you about it, and then I started a Pinterest board about it. And you said it was she's one of the people I let in my Pinterest account. So, and you said, what are you going to do with that? Remember? So I do. Bearden is the only visual artist who's in it right now, although Carrie James Marshall comes in and out. But mostly it's musicians and literature. So there's the section that I read for you today actually goes into some of those women writers who I discovered around the same time that my mother was sewing. And there's, lots of music because the music is as ubiquitous as the train is in the Bearden images. There's a train everywhere. And when I think about my life and my relationship to art, it's music that's just so ubiquitous that I almost don't even think about it. I have to sit down and stop. And so there's a lot of music in it. But this image in particular is the most dominant visual image for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you mentioned this, I missed it. Why is the dressmaker blue? Because it makes it look like it's a memory as opposed to an actual fitting.
Yeah. So, I love what you ask because I think that your answer, like the answer is embedded in the way you ask the question. I feel the same way, but I see that with Bearden all the time, that there are these images, usually of, often of women, that either in color or shape or form make them seem something other, right? And it could be that, I don't think there's a specific answer that, it's the spirit of the Virgin Mother Mary or something, but that there's just something for me that calls our attention to the fact that this figure is not only a person, but could be a memory, could be a myth, could be a symbol, could be any number of those things. And I like to think of it as positioning the seamstress alongside those really important sort of spiritual and artistic figures, whether they be the blues man or the conjure woman or any other archetype. In this image, I think that the seamstress is one of those archetype figures, whereas this one, she's still different, but she's not quite as, otherworldly as that one. That's very spirit-like figure there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There was a hand there. Hi, Gail. Mm-hmm.
Pink top. When you mention Pinterest, it makes me wonder what social media platforms are your preferred platforms and how they inspire or inform your work as a scholar, as an academic.
So Twitter and Facebook keep me from doing my work because Desiree will know that I'm on it all the time. And they just make me angry. Twitter makes me angry, and Facebook is more like checking in with family and friends. But Instagram and Pinterest because they're images. And so I follow a lot of visual artists on Instagram, and a lot of poets I follow on Instagram, writers who give I just find it very evocative. And I also follow Miss Tina Knowles, Beyonce's mother. Should follow her. And Pinterest to me is an archive. It's a place where I can archive, because you can find everything, but it's usually out of context. But you can find lots of images. So I learned the history, which you all are fortunate you didn't get it, but I learned the whole history of the sewing machine and when Singer, and I was trying to make this connection between sewing machines and trains. But a lot of that I got on Pinterest, believe it or not. You can get all that stuff.
What was the sewing machine train connection that you made?
So for me, just in terms of images, I thought that, the train is everywhere, but it made me think of what are some other objects that I see in Bearden a lot, and so I see snakes a lot. But the sewing machine, just appeared again and again in these two paintings, and it also has that kind of background in both instances. They're sort of in the background. They're not the center of the visual image itself, and yet they communicate so much. And to me, it's very much shaped like some of the trains that we see in the background. They're similar shapes, similar color. In all of a lot of the images, it's full with color. It's awash with color, and then you have the stark black train or the sewing machine. The train usually has this place where the smoke is coming out. There, it's where the bobbin and the thread are. They just very similar in shape and color. And so I thought if people interested in the trains, you know, I'm interested in the sewing machines, but they seem to be doing a kind of similar work in the story that it tells. Yeah, so thank you. And the sound, right? You know, the sound and how evocative the sound can be. And there's a way that the sewing machine is also mobile, right? It's, you know, because you're moving it along, and you're starting with nothing and you end up with something. Well, I don't. I never end up with anything when I sew. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, there's one here.
Thank you. I want to just really thank you for this again. I think one of the things that makes this show so powerful for me is I think it is autobiographical for so many of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so for you to point out those images, my grandmother was also a seamstress.
Wow. Thank you.
And so I was telling my husband, I said, that's my grandmother's sewing machine.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that, and keep working on the book. We can't wait to read it.
Thank you. But you know, I encourage you, if you haven't seen the show, definitely go see it. And if you've seen it, go see it again, because like I want to see it again, because there's so many, you know, I was listening to the film that accompanies it, where Bearden's talking about something evoking a memory and opening up a memory, and then these kind of floodgates open. And that's exactly what his work does. I can see why August Wilson, you know, got so much out of it, because of the spaces, and Stephanie's essay talks about the kind of spaces that he leaves for us to enter into the work. He also creates complete worlds. Like some of the smallest works, you get close in it, and there's a whole world there in that work. So,
We'll take one last question.
sure,
back here.
one last. Mm-hmm. Maybe two last.
Yes. I noticed a chicken. There's a chicken in a number of that image. So I wonder, did Romare Bearden have any connection to Cuba and the Santa Rita? Did he visit Cuba or have any, or why is the chicken
Okay,
there?
I'll tell you a funny story about chickens, but Deirdre, do you know, I mean, I thought it was just because the doors were open, the chickens. Right, right. Yeah. Right.
But his wife's family is from St. Martin in the Caribbean, and Bearden did a whole series called The Obeah, which some of you might remember, and that's all about the spiritual and you know, rituals, and where birds are used. So
When I first started looking at, that's how I would say, oh, that must be a southern image because the chickens are in the house. And then I realized I grew up in a neighborhood where you could hear a rooster on occasion in South Philadelphia, so it didn't have to be a southern image.
Yeah, and it's also a symbol of the male. You
The
know,
rooster, symbol of men,
roosters,
of the male, right?
Yeah.
There's just one more question I saw right there, and then we can,
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm just curious to know about your book, what musicians inspired you?
Oh, my goodness.
Because I'm a musician myself.
Oh, wow.
And so I just wanted to know which musicians are in your book.
There's so many. I can't name one. You know, I'm trying to think who runs consistently throughout. Miles is consistently throughout. Earth, Wind, and Fire. In fact, the epigraph to that chapter that I read from is from an Earth, Wind, and Fire song that says, if there ain't no beauty, you gotta make some beauty. You know that song that has that line in it, that you have to make beauty in the world. I have a chapter on my family had a little restaurant. It was more like a luncheonette. And the chapter is really on the jukebox there and the kind of intergenerational music that was on the jukebox and who came in. You could tell who was in the space based on what music was playing. And the restaurant was of the era, those of you who know this music will know, of the era that the new songs, it was when we were always listening for what Marvin Gaye or Stevie Wonder would do. that it was this transformative period for them, and we felt like we were on a journey with them. So the jukebox always got that. So it's hard to pick one because it's just, there's so much. There's so much, yeah. Probably more music than even literature or the visual arts. So, yeah. So thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for being here.